diffuse tension imaging. And I'm not going to be speaking over your head, okay? I'm going to make this very practical. But you can understand that the way I look at depression and all the other features of that, I always go from the brain. What is the brain telling us? What is the brain doing or not doing? Okay, that's real important. And there is some research to also tell that if you understand how the brain works, how the right side connects with the left side, how the front connects to the back side, how the bottom to the top, you're going to open up more connectivity in your brain. Does that make sense? Okay? And that's very, very important. And our brain has been created that way to use in multifaceted ways. So I do use this as a basis as far as the brain. And this is, as you can see, all these fibers here. This is the brain stem, and this is going up into the parietal area back here where we see in the frontal lobes and everything. You know, these are the white matter tracks, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I have to point it up here, is that it? Okay, good. So what's major depressive disorder? When people think about depression, they think about, well, it's a mood disorder. And it is a mood disorder, but you can see up there as well, it affects one's cognition, one's thinking, one's ability to organize, one's ability to problem solve, huh? And we'll talk about that, what depression does do when you're truly depressed and how it affects your thinking and your mentation. And then behavior, that's action, right? So depression has a consequence of changing your actions. We'll talk about that as well. And then your physical status, you know, that can be, you know, how you feel inside, how your gut is, how you're sleeping, all the physical things that are part of life as well. So depression is a component of all of these and probably more. So when you're looking at this individual, one would say he's depressed, okay, just the first visuals of that. And what depression does do in cognition in terms of how you think, it does this. It narrows your ability to think, to be creative, to be able to consider options. It does this, it closes your brain down so that you become so internally focused, very internally focused. And look at, this person is in the corner, if you will. What does it do behaviorally? You isolate. You want to isolate. You want to kind of cower down. So physically it does that, you know, as well as cognitively in terms of how you think. When I'm doing evaluation with people, one of the things I'll ask them is, how is your concentration? How is your memory? How are you able to problem solve and what have you? That slows down. And in fact, those individuals who are depressed, their brain is going so slow, when they look at outside themselves, they see that everything is going fast, that everything outside is going fast. And with somebody who has manic depressive illness, we'll talk about that, things are going so fast inside, but out here, things are going so slow. Do you see that? Did you get that? Huh? Okay. So just got to do this here. So here it is in terms of an individual, and the emphasis here will be understanding how and what's happening here in terms of an individual's well-being. And look at this here as well. Whoops, whoa, let me go back here. Here we go. So look at these cross fibers. Remember I was talking about making this connection side of the brain to this side, the front to the back? Do you see those fibers, those white matter? Those are the things that transmit areas of the brain. They're the railroad tracks of the brain, okay? That's what they are. They're the railroad tracks of the brain. And when these things are not working, okay, you're not making connectivity in terms of your thoughts, in terms of your actions, in terms of your mood, in terms of physically what's happening in your body as well. So here's another picture. You can tell I like colored pictures, huh? Yeah, I used to like to use crayons when I was a kid, and I always loved the art teacher with those big, thick crayons, you know, and you'd color and what have you. So here we looking at that there's structural as well as cell loss in the brain with people who are depressed. We see that in research. And one of the major areas that we're going to focus on is right here in the frontal lobes, okay? Because that has to do a lot with our thinking and our planning and organizing. And then we're also going to talk about this here. This is what we call our emotional area of the brain. It's got a fancy term called limbic. And basically, it has so much to do with how your mood is, okay? So much to do with that. And so what we do see in individuals, and whoops, again, here, I'm messing that, forgive me. Here we go. Here we go. So what we do see with individuals is a thinning, okay, of the cortex, okay? That's where all your gray matter is. That's where all your cells are and what have you. We see the density, the thickness of those areas of the brain, they're thinner. And if you don't have as many, guess what happens, Greg? You don't have that connectivity. You don't have that connectivity at all. So we'll talk more about that as well. And so let me go here. So here is a PET scan. You can see on this side of the brain, so this side here is a normal brain. What do you notice about the color here? What color is it? It's yellow. And yellow indicates a lot of metabolism happening, oxygen change happening, as well as glucose, because our body and our brain needs glucose. So we see that happening here. But look at this depressed individual. What's going on here in terms of the front part of their brain? It's suppressed. It's suppressed, okay? Again, I want to emphasize that, that depression is not a matter of, you know, God punishing me. It's not a matter of I'm not pulling myself up by my bootstraps, if you will. Depression is a biological entity, and we'll talk about various forms about that. And that's very, very important to consider. So here's another part. Look at this. Whoops, whoops. This is messing with my head. Sorry, guys. You're going to have to live through this.
Can we get a scan of you right now?
Yeah, you'll scan me right now, and this is me right here. That part of the brain's not working, eh? So look at this area, and you can see the color chart here as you go up. There, that shows that there's more oxygen exchange as well as glucose. We can measure sugar in the brain. That's how we can see areas of the brain, whether they're functioning or not functioning. Look at over here. What's happening to that front part of the brain? And that's where you begin to, in terms of your thinking, you begin to go into a box. Okay? You internalize so much that you can't even begin to think about what's going outside and around you because your brain is doing this. It's shutting down. Here it is, another picture here as well. In terms of a depressed brain, you could see that. This is kind of looking a top-down look, what we call an axial look, but you can see the non-depressed brain, and you can see it's lighting up more, okay? And here's our beautiful cells, okay? This is a nerve cell. We call them neurons, okay? And isn't that beautiful? And how many of them do you think you got going in your brain? 2, okay. He needs help over here. They say anywhere between 80 and 100 billion, okay? And we're beautifully created, wonderfully created. And these things have a lot to do with depression and so many other things, multiple sclerosis, somebody gets a traumatic brain injury, Huntington's disease. You know, these cells are affected by many, many things, and we're going to talk about that as well. So I put this up here, and I have some nice other slides, but what I want to bring you to attention to is, do you see this middle one here? And it says it's the depressed state. Look at the normal, if you will, normal state. Do you see these? These are dendrites, and basically what they are is they help connect one nerve to another nerve. And look at this here. You can see these dendrites, there's plenty. What do you see on this tree? Diminished. So that has to do with connectivity again, doesn't it? Okay, that your nerve cells are not working as they should. And then look at someone who was treated, okay? And I'm going to talk about antidepressants. I'm not going to get a lot into that, but I will talk about that in terms of stroke and inflammation and, oh, what's been going on for 2 years now? COVID, isn't it? And COVID is basically an inflammation of the brain. And guess what's one of the treatments they're using to tone down these inflammatory markers in the brain? An antidepressant, Luvox, fluvoxamine, okay? And I dare say if somebody's on Lexapro and all other antidepressants, they're working in a similar fashion as well. But you can see here that this tree, we'll call it a tree, it doesn't have these mushrooms, if you will, these dendrites, and so it can't connect, if you will, with other neurons, okay? And so this here is looking at, in terms of, let me see here. Basically, this is looking at connectivity, okay? And it's in different areas of the brain. This is looking at the front part of the brain. Remember I told you that? Then this is looking at the, what we call the limbic, the emotional area of the brain. And also connected to that is an area of the brain that has to do with our memory. And notice this, the connectivity is much higher here, but as we go along here and look at individuals who are depressed, we can see they're measuring that connectivity, okay? It's not happening. Does that make sense, that slide? Does it? If it doesn't, let me know. I'll try to rephrase it, okay? Don't be shy about that. This is a complicated slide. We always have to have a complicated slide, right? I mean, otherwise, what good would it do? This is a slide you do have to memorize, and when you come tomorrow, you'll have a quiz on it, okay? And there is a final test at the end of this whole thing. This is the take-home message. This is Helen Mayberg's work, okay? Very, very interesting work. I don't want you to get caught up with all the terms and what have you, okay? But this really has to do with the front part of the brain, okay? And what she found is that individuals who are depressed, and you already saw some pictures, this front part of the brain doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's not synapsing, it's not connecting, it's not firing like a car, like pistons and what have you. Where this part of the brain, the mood part of the brain, is over functioning. Do you get that? One part of the brain is not functioning well, this front part of the brain in terms of how we concentrate, and then the part with our mood is very intense and it's firing, it's over connecting. And guess what happens when we treat that individual with a depression? The mood and that area that was firing too much, that quiets down. And what happens to the front part of the brain with our thinking and our planning, that begins to light up. We see that. And this work, Helen's work, came out of the work they were doing in neurology with people with Parkinson's disorder. You know what Parkinson's disorder is? It's a mood as well as a cognitive, but we always look at it as a movement disorder or motor disorder. It's all of that, okay? And she took from their work placement. They would place these electrodes deep down inside of the brain, called the subthalamus area and the basal ganglia. Don't worry about that. And an individual who had Parkinson's disorder, because of being on dopamine, all the whatever they were on, and they stimulate that. They have a little, if you will, I'm sorry? Yeah, and they'll stimulate that, and guess what happens? The individual who's kind of walking like this walks like this. I've seen it. I've seen that happen in terms of the studies and what have you. And so she then took that same type of work, and she said, why can't we apply that to depression? And so, yes, that's what they did. They looked at those two areas of the brain. One was not functioning. It was what we call hypofunctioning. And the other area of the brain that had to do with mood was hyperfunctioning. And then you treat them with an antidepressant, and you get the opposite happen. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So depression, I mean, clearly, it's a major, major disorder in the brain and what have you. And I want you to take note of this, okay? In midlife, it can occur older with medical illness, diabetes. We're going to be talking about these things and how you can take care of your health and have good brain maintenance by managing, your sugars, cancer, heart disease, strokes, and what have you, Parkinson's disease. There are many, many degenerative disorders that present initially with anxiety or depression. That's what we see, if you will. So here we go. So look at this here, 17.3 million people. This is the earliest data I could get from NIMH 2017 here. And 7% of the population suffered at least one depression, okay? That's a lot of people. And what do you notice here? Women are nearly twice as likely than men to have depression. And we'll talk about that too. I get consulted from OBGYN. Jim, could you see this mom? She's delivered a baby. And it isn't just the postpartum blues. The individual is suffering a depression, So we'll talk about that. But it is really prevalent among women as well as men. So look at this breakdown here. When we look at sex, again, this data is coming, it's not too bad. This is Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Association. Look at female, male. Then if you break it down to the age, look at this, 18 to 25. 30%, 26 to 49, 25%. Here, 50 plus, 14.5%. And notice, in terms of looking at race, who suffers more depression when you look at Hispanics versus blacks versus Asians versus Caucasians? The whites. They suffer more depression, if you will. We're going to break this down a little more here. No, we've already got that, Jim. Okay, so look at this here. This is before COVID, okay? So here is the black line. This is what they were gathering data for before COVID struck, okay? And this here is during COVID. But notice how it flips. It becomes, in terms of measuring that against pre-COVID, in terms of somebody who had a mild depression, somebody who has a moderate depression, somebody who had a severe depression, moderately severe, and somebody who had a severe depression. Notice that COVID contributed to a lot of depression, a lot of depression. And I do I am very concerned about the use of masks and its effect on our children. And I won't go there, but our expressions, our ability to communicate is so important. And we mature people, that means older people, Greg, when we're looking at an individual and trying to understand whether they're trustworthy, we tend to look down here. But guess what? I can't see from here down there with masks. So there's a lot of, if you will, collateral, I think, concerns around just more than just the COVID itself, if you will. Okay, so this is a difficult slide to read here. But what is this? Is this the one? Okay, this is after COVID. Okay, before and after COVID. Okay, so what we're looking here is depressive symptoms, okay, before, and then we're looking at depressive symptoms after. Look at this, 6.9%. And look at the jump, okay, after COVID hit. Almost 22%. That's almost what's a 3.5-fold increase, isn't it? Huh? And what's one of the things that has happened with COVID? Stress, inflammation, and we're going to talk about that. Hopefully, we'll get to that tonight as well. And so you can look at that breakdown in terms of this is men versus women. Look at females, about 10%. Look at this, 33%. Increase, or 33%, so that's about 23% increase in terms of experiencing depressive symptoms. That's not a good situation. Okay, and I'm going to skip that slide. We'll skip that one. Okay, so what are the target symptoms you look for when somebody's depressed? Remember I told you about thinking, mood, actions, and your physical body? Well, let's look at some of these target symptoms that we see. A persistent, sad, anxious, and empty mood. Huh? There's your mood. A sense of hopelessness and pessimism. Doesn't that have to do with more in terms of how you see yourself and how you evaluate yourself? It has more to do with thinking, if you will. Irritability. And I see this, I don't work with younger people, but that's what we'll see is irritability. In us mature people, when I used to do consults in a nursing home, the older folks were more irritable, more cantankerous and what have you. Feelings of guilt, worthlessness, and helplessness and what have you. There again, if you recall that individual crouching down, you know, he's basically, his brain is going into a box and there's no reality testing, no checking and saying, hey, this is not the way it should be, yes?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Yeah.
In the nursing home, the cantankerous irritability, did you attribute it to anything specific or generally all kinds of?
Well, when you go into a nursing home, I'll see somebody with all variations of dementia, Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, frontal temple dementia, all kinds of types of cognitive loss. And then individuals, as we get older too, our ability to process information really declines, and we don't have as much of these neurons to connect and what have you. And then you have all these individuals who had a stroke, okay, who might have had a TBI, okay. I had a guy who had a TBI at one of the nursing homes up here, and his front part of his brain wasn't working, okay? And the front part of your brain is the brakes. Can you imagine if you don't have brakes in your car? Huh? Not good, right? You go to put your brakes on and crash. And this fella had a significant hemorrhage. You don't live from hemorrhages, but anyhow, you're going to think this is kind of, gee, Jim, you're making fun of him. No, I wasn't making fun of him. He would come up to the nursing station, and he would say, how you doing? And I go, pretty good. How are you doing? He said, oh, I'm good. And then I said, do you like that song, Nothing But a Hound Dog? and he would start singing Nothing But a Hound Dog. His brain, the way he operated, was based on what was in his environment. So when he would go to eat, he couldn't eat with the other residents. He had to eat separately over here because the stimulus was, oh, food. What do you do when you see food? You eat. He doesn't have the breaks. He goes and he's swallowing and eating everybody else's food. Yeah? And so there's many things, degenerative disorders going on, just aging itself, that can contribute to that irritability. And trying to sort that out is like going into a jungle. If anything tested my skills was being and doing evaluations in a nursing home. Very, very difficult. Yeah, sure. So decreased energy. You know, let's go back here. Loss of interest, no motivation, no pleasure, nothing. You could have $1 million in the bank, it don't matter. You know, you could have a beautiful home, beautiful children, family, and what have you, but this whole, what we call lack of motivation, real lack, no drive, that's different than not having energy. You just don't have the energy. You don't have the get up and go. The get up and go is get up and gone, if you will, okay? And that's a little different. Moving or talking more slowly. Remember I told you about that? We call it, fancy word, psychomotor retardation. People, they almost look Parkinsonian, you know, their movements are slowed down, if you will. And here's this, I think, going along with this restlessness goes back to this irritability and agitation, concentrating, remembering. And actually, I would see people and they would ask me, Jim, could you see this person? Because we think they have early dementia. But guess what? It was depression. It was what we call false, if you will, pseudo-dementia, if you will. And concentration goes out the door, remembering, making decisions and what have you. And here comes the physical part as well. This is the key thing. Sleep goes out the window. Generally speaking, that's the typical presentation. I have a hard time falling asleep, or if I can fall asleep, I wake up in the middle of the night, or I have what we call, I wake up at the end of my sleep cycle as well. But sleep is very, very important. We always look at that. Appetite and weight changes as well. You don't want to eat. If you're feeling worthless, if you're feeling hopeless, why would you feed yourself? Huh? And it's always one of the things I ask. If the patient can't tell me, I'll ask the wife or the husband or whatever. I'll say, hey, what's her weight been like in the past couple months? Oh, she's lost 10 pounds, Jim. 10 pounds. Ooh, that's not good. So you can see going into a box, you know, some of the basic things we do as humans is we take care of ourselves, we nurture ourselves when we eat food. And so that's gone out the door. Thoughts of death and suicide, I'll come to that probably tomorrow. And then these are all these aches, pains, cramps, digestive problems and all of that. It's called somatic, physical complaints. You have that. So if I do, let's say I have an issue with my hip. If I were to get depressed, that gets magnified. Huh? Whatever physical ailments you have, it gets magnified. It's kind of like the molehill is made into a mountain. So that goes along with it as well.
Is that a psychosomatic sense of pain, or is it a reality of the increased pain?
It's their perception of the pain. Okay? But it doesn't mean that they're not having pain. But subjectively, how they perceive the pain, there's physical pain, but then how do you perceive that pain? Subjectively.
Whether it's overwhelming and controlling versus
Right.
not.
Right? Yeah, yeah. And what we'll see a lot is with the mature people who are older, the somatization, they're physically complaining of all these things. So they go to their PCP, you know, their provider, and say, gee, my stomach's been upset, and I've got this going on, I've got that going on. They got multiple things. You have to look at, gee, is there possibly an underlying mood disorder or something going on here? You know, sorting that out. So I'm not going to get into that. I should go over here. But when we look at ourselves, look at what we consist of. We have moods. Socialization is so important, so important. That goes out the window when you're depressed. Occupational, gee, I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. If I'm depressed, am I able gonna use the skills and the experience I have? This furthers my sense of worthlessness, if you will. Financial, okay? Environmental, Physical, the somatic, the thinking, intellectual. And then we don't talk about this a lot. Spiritual, the spiritual side of us, especially if the individual is getting depressed to a point where their thinking, their reasoning is less and less and less. And it's less and less and less. And they begin to experience a psychosis. And they begin to have delusions. They begin to hear voices and those type of things that they experience is, I'm no good. I have terrible clothes on. Can't you see that, Jim? I am just worthless. I'm no good. They can't, what we call reality test, okay? Because of what's not happening, or what is happening in the brain, if you will. So when we talk about how do we treat, how we're going to treat an individual, you have to consider all of this. Some people come to see me to get evaluated. They only want to look at medications. Give me some medications, Jim. And I kind of say, what about sunshine? What about walking? What about smelling lilacs? And I'll ask them, when you came in here today, what did you experience? At Gifford, people have been to Gifford Hospital. We have beautiful, beautiful flowers outside and in the summertime, and I'll say, you didn't see those flowers? Did you smell them? No, I didn't. That's mindfulness. We'll talk about that as well. So don't try to, or just looking at medications is a real, nearsighted way of approaching depression, because you have to consider all these other things as well. Real important, okay? And so here we go. You got this tree, and we look at underneath this tree, you got inflammation. I'm going to really focus on that. Inflammation, poor diet. Huh? Do you think diet has anything to do with your mood? Huh? Big time, big time, And your diet, if your cholesterol's up, your lipids, and your triglycerides and all of that are up, guess what that does to these pipes we got in our brain and throughout our body, these vessels, like that. And as a result of that, then what happens? We get what we call hypertension. And as it is, if you're 40 or older, and I don't see anybody older than 40 here, so it doesn't apply to you. But if anybody's 40 and older, anyhow, your brain is beginning to have too much pounds per square inch in those vessels, and there's little happening in your brain, if you will.
Hypertension or hypotension?
Hypertension. So, let's say a good blood pressure is, I think they're looking at now almost 100 over 60, 65. But if your blood pressure is 190 over 90, ooh, you look at your pipes in the house. It says PSI. You go above that PSI, guess what happens to that copper pipe? That's going on inside our brain. And I'll just say this. What I've read in research, my experience over the years and everything, this is the basis of almost all autoimmune processes, whether it's hypothyroidism, whether it's fibromyalgia, whether it's depression, whether it's multiple sclerosis. Yes, there are genetic concerns there as well that What is autoimmune process? Inflammation. Your body's turning in on itself. Huh? Your body's turning in on itself and destroying itself. And I'll talk about that in terms of some research. Lack of purpose. I mean, you don't have any purpose and meaning in life. You know, you're floating out there in the sea and what have you. Ooh, what's this? Toxic relationships. Huh? Constant conflict, constant arguing that then contributes to inflammation. Huh? Big time. Poor self-image, the environment. What do you think that's in the environment that can be contributing to one's mood state? Any thoughts about that? The news. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. And John, I actually have to tell patients, how much are you watching? Oh, I'm watching 3 hours. I said, whoa, 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 yeah, right, yeah. That the news is an environmental stressor, if you will. Were you going to say something, Pastor Tom?
As beautiful as Vermont is, I remember we moved here 2.5 years ago. I came here to interview, and it was I saw people walking downtown, and I thought, man, they look worn out. Why do they look so exhausted? And my sister said, well, we just had 10 feet of snow last winter. It's been a long, hard winter.
Mm.
When you are in a more pleasant area when it comes to weather, or all those things, the contributing factors here, we don't realize that
Big time.
more challenging and the bitter, cold, dark days and all that stuff, it takes a toll on us.
So true. When I don't even get vitamin D levels with patients. And by the way, you should be taking vitamin D in the summer and all the way through the fall and all the way through the winter and all the way through the spring. I don't even get vitamin D levels. They're usually in the northeast corridor. They're low or below normal. And I say, let's start with 2,000, and I'd like you to get up to take 5,000 units. Yeah, that's nothing. And I was at a conference out in California and sitting next to this psychiatrist, and they were talking about vitamin D. And he says, I take 20 units, 20,000 units a day. And I says, you're out in California. He says, I'm indoors all the time. It made sense to me, you know.
In the Diabetes Undone seminar, they say 70% of the population has low vitamin D levels.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Genetics, that's a big part. We see, I'll always be asking when I'm evaluating, can you tell me on your father's side or your mom's side, was there any depression? How about your cousins, your first cousin? How about your great-grandparents? Anything like that? Because there is a genetic loading that does happen with depression, okay? It's no different than Kathy here. If she were to show me pictures of her mom or dad or her grandparents, there's going to be some similarity there somewhere, genetically, right? You do look like somebody, okay? You are unique and what have you, but that's also true for a lot of other things, especially some of these psychiatric illnesses as well, the genetics that are involved. And look at this here, sedentary lifestyle. Oh my, how much TV do you watch? I have a young kid that's on the computer 8 hours a day. He's not exercising there, is he? No. Exercise is so important, and we'll be talking about that. I don't know about today, but hopefully tomorrow we'll be talking about exercise and what it does to these inflammation markers in our brain. Okay? Very, very interesting things that are going on. And again, you're saying, Jim, why are you throwing all of this stuff at me? Because you can do something about it. You can do something about your diet. You can do something about the lifestyle you have, what you're eating. You can do something about the exposure to stress. And it's not all about medications, okay? And I always tell patients it's one piece of the pie, just one piece of the pie. Look at all these other things. And I'm trying to give you a basis to understand why exercise is important, why structured sleep is important, why we'll talk about caffeine and all this kind of stuff. And all that stuff affects you physically, if you will. And I don't care what you tell me. I've been in the business long enough. And someone will say, oh, I watch horror movies. You know? And I said, you like horror movies? They scare me. I don't know about you. And she says, yeah, I don't have any feelings about it. No, 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 no. Your brain's taking in all that visual stuff. Your brain is taking in all that sounds of horror and what have you. So don't kid yourself about these video games. Don't kid yourself about Hollywood and what they're putting out there and the propaganda that's happening. And it is propaganda. Trust me, it's propaganda. It affects your brain. It affects your well-being. It affects your ability to discern, to know the right path to take versus the wrong path to take. If you get so anesthetized, you know, almost like going under surgery there, you get so anesthetized, you know, seeing somebody get hurt, what have you, you know. And there's this lack of awareness. This front part of the brain is not observing.
I was going to say, the algorithms that they have in social media now, they try to take you down a certain path. And a lot of the division that we find on many fronts is chasing algorithms in social media. It's groupthink, and you lose your individuality. You find yourself, you know, people are becoming unhappy, and they probably spend more time doing that with COVID than they were prior. So I just see that social media aspect as
Yeah.
a contributing factor to your environment.
So true. And socialization is so important when I'm working with families who have a grandfather or their husband has dementia or their wife has dementia. I say, I know this is hard, but socialization is so important to the brain. Engage them outside the home. I know it's very difficult. Socialization. Think about this, Kathy. When you had a child and you looked at them and you smiled and you da-da-da-da, how did they begin to internalize and experience this empathy visually, emotionally, and what have you? And we know with individuals who have schizophrenia, it's not schizophrenic, no, schizophrenia. It's an illness. And moms, they struggle with how they see themselves and what have you, and it really is a neurological illness. And I've seen it in film and what have you, and they've got the newborn, but they're not looking at the newborn, okay? And I usually do a test if somebody has schizophrenia to see if they have a certain movement and what have you, but they don't look at the child, and what do you think the child does? The child looks away. And so this idea of social contact is so, so important to be able to have that. And what it does too is it helps, let's call these neurons right here underneath the tree. Doesn't it look like your brain, huh? It does look like your brain, huh? All these things that are connecting to each other and what have you. And what it does do, if you are talking to this person and this person and this person, it activates your brain. You begin to associate and you begin to develop little new tributaries of ideas in your brain, if that makes sense, huh? And that's what Thomas Edison used to do. When he would hire people, we know Thomas Edison, a lot of things he invented, he would hire somebody, their ability to associate and connect dots. And he would gather his workers in a group and they would just exchange ideas. Just exchange ideas, because what she says, what you said, what you said, what you said, then creates a thought in my mind. Are you following me here? Are you following me? This makes sense? So socialization is so important. What did I say about when you get depressed? That's one of the things you do is you withdraw. You intensify that depression, if you will. And then what does it create? Yeah, diabetes, arthritis. Arthritis, Jim? Yeah. Thyroid disorders. I told you, I'm of the opinion that most of these disorders we suffer from are autoimmune. That means our body is turning in on itself. And yes, cancer. Cancer. It's called a paraneoplastic disorder. Don't worry about that fancy word. And you have a tumor. But guess how it shows itself initially? It shows itself with an autoimmune disease, be it fibromyalgia, be it hypothyroidism. It shows and manifests itself initially as an autoimmune disease, where the body is turning in on itself. And isn't that what cancer is? In terms of the body proliferating and turning in on itself? Blood pressure, we talked about that. Insomnia, yeah, you can't sleep. Look at this, diabetes. That's one of the major diseases that are going on in our society now, and for a lot of reasons. But what diabetes does to the body is it's very damaging in terms of these blood vessels, what it does to your heart and what have you. I'll talk more about inflammation, and if there's anything you're going to leave with, you're going to say, that guy really believes in inflammation. I need to begin to look at that. How do I address inflammation? But you can do something about it. Do you get that? You can do something about it. I can exercise, I can walk, I can do Tai Chi, okay? I could go volunteer, okay? I can do so many things to address, okay, inflammation. And yeah, enough news, okay? Let me do this. Let me listen to some very pleasant music, not head-banging music. Huh? Can you imagine the kids doing this to their head and what have you? You know that neuron, that green one you saw? It shears that. It shears that, the head-banging. It puts you almost into a trance and what have you. So let me move on here. Whoa, what happened? Oh, here we go. Here we go. So as I mentioned, huh? It is. It is. I'm past my bedtime too. Kids, I'd have the kids set up, the TV for me and said, Dad, you got to press this to this to this to this. I said, look, I just want to press one button. That's it. I know what I know and I know what I don't know. Or I choose not to want to learn, if you will. But there's variations on depression, okay? You can be depressed because of an adjustment issue, I'm making a transition from married life, of divorce, and I'm making a transition to single life in that, That's an adjustment. You're adjusting to something. It's creating stress, inflammation, grief. Grief is it doesn't mean you have to treat grief with an antidepressant. And a number of years ago, when I was working at the psych unit down in Worcester on Belmont Street, Worcester Memorial Hospital, a Greek lady came in, John. And she looked depressed to me. She looked depressed to all the other people. You know what we found out, Greg? She was grieving as a Greek 7 years. She was going through a Greek process. She would dress in black. And so culture is part of this, hey? Our culture, if you will. Think about those people who live, and the pastor did talk about that, and we'll talk about that in terms of sunlight and people who live up in the northern or southern part of the earth. Yeah. And not getting that daylight and its effect, and we'll talk about that hopefully too. But, and then I'm mentioning depression in terms of what we call bipolar. I come from the old school and I use the word manic depressive illness, okay? And I've seen it where, I remember up at CVMC, guy came in and looked very depressed. We did a good evaluation on him, good history, got collateral information and everything. So we treated him with an antidepressant. 4 days later, that guy was hanging from the chandeliers, and he had manic depressive illness. Yes? Did you have your hand up? No? Oh, I'm sorry. And so there's grief. Then due to a medical disorder, yeah. I saw a gentleman today who has Parkinson's disorder, having visual hallucinations, delusions, auditory hallucinations, and what have you. Oh, Jim, I'm seeing these little people. We call them, if you will, Lilliputians. Remember Gulliver's Travel? And it's affecting his brainstem and what have you. And he's seeing these things and what have you. They're benign, they're not bothering, but he says, why are they in my house? But then his face, and people with Parkinson's disorder have a mass face. It's very flat. And then the tears just come down. And he's depressed. Not only does he have Parkinson's, okay, the motor issues that, he has depression. It's a mood disorder, as well as a motor disorder, as well as a cognitive disorder. It's a neuropsychiatric disorder. And I see many people who come in who have these other, they've seen a neurologist, and they'll consult with me, and they have all of these other neurological disorders. And I evaluate them and said, oh, they have a neuropsychiatric disorder. Do you get that? Okay. We have a saying, nerves, neurons that wire together, that's mood, thought, and behavior and action. Neurons that wire together, they fire together. Did you get that? That's why this individual who has Parkinson's disorder presents primarily with that, but he has depression. And likely he's going to have some cognitive loss as unfortunately his illness will. Look at this here. We'll talk a little about that. Cannabis, oh yeah. I think that in Vermont, aren't they going to be selling it recreationally? Okay, yeah. What do you mean, Jim? Cannabis is good for me. Oh, yeah, you shake my hand, and it's like a dead fish. Can you imagine what that does cognitively? The studies up at McGill, 5 and 10 year studies that happened up there with people using cannabis over a period of time. People coming off cannabis suffer from depression. People coming off cocaine suffer from depression. People coming off meth suffer from depression. Alcohol is a depressive, isn't it? And I used to run an inpatient substance abuse unit, and I would see this all the time. Yeah, they had alcohol problems, but guess what they were doing? They were using alcohol. That's not right. They were self-medicating themselves with alcohol, and underlying that, we began to see, oh, they have an anxiety disorder, Greg. Can we treat this? Yeah, you don't have to go here and use alcohol. And so then they have a comorbid, what we call illness. And then there's this premenstrual dysphoric illness that happens to women who have what? Menstruation. Prior to their menses just starting, they're real irritable. Not everybody, but they're irritable. Well, what's happening to the woman's hormone? What's happening to estrogen, progesterone? What's happening to all of those hormones? There's a major change going on. And we'll talk about that also in context, as I mentioned, as far as a woman, a mom, who has just delivered a baby and suffers from depression. And what are the hormones that are part of that? Here we go, Jim. So I just put this slide up here to show you that, yeah, some people suffer from depression, but there's a quarter of people who suffer from this manic depression, if you will. And when we see that, and I'll just make this statement, I'll probably repeat it again, we need not judge a mom, and I know this is going to be hard for you to hear this, who takes the life of her infant. What we see is they're suffering from a significant depression with psychosis. And yes, maybe there are some moms that there's other reasons or what have you, but you begin to really question yourself as a mom. You have command auditory hallucinations telling you to do X, Y, and Z. And I know that sounds very horrific, but something's going on there hormonally with a mom, if you will. Okay, and so these are the kind of variations. Here's this melancholic. We see this with older people. And as I was mentioning, and I've had a number of consults, we have a great OBGYN unit at Gifford Hospital, and if you're thinking of having a baby, come on down there. It's a great, great facility. People come from all over the place to have their children there. But individuals who, get so depressed, you can become psychotic after a pregnancy, if you will. And then there's this postpartum baby blues. That happens and what have you, and you have to sort that out from a real depression. And then as Pastor Tom was mentioning, seasonal affective disorder that happens in seasons, I don't know about you, but when that daylight, and you don't have as much daylight, my brain starts to shut off. You're shaking your head. Do you notice that? Yes. Yeah. Your brain shuts off. And anybody, do you remember the show Northern Lights that had to do with people living up in the Alaska and the Antarctic and what have you? It was so funny. One of the sitcoms or what have you, or whatever you call it, one of the shows had to do with just that, about depression. And guess what all the people were doing around the village as you saw them? They all had hats with lights underneath it so they could get light. And I'm going to talk about light boxes, I think probably Thursday, and how to use light boxes. And again, looking at this from a much broader perspective and what have you. And then there's all these other features that can happen in terms of someone having anxiety disorder, somebody doesn't want to go outside, panic, social disorder, and specific phobias that can have an OCD. Sometimes we'll see that mixed in there, okay? It's not as clear-cut as you think. Okay, so I wanted to mention this about post-stroke depression, okay? And you know what we see with people who suffer from a stroke? Inflammation. We can measure inflammation markers, okay? Creatinine, CRP. We can measure interleukin-1, 6, and what have you. And these are all inflammation markers that your body sends out because what is it doing in a stressful situation? It's ready for fight, flight, or freeze. So it sends out all these protective signals that you got to be ready, Jim. Your body has to protect yourself and what have you. And in post-stroke depression, Dr. Robertson did tremendous work with this, and he looked at individuals who suffered a stroke and were depressed, not because, they had some, problems speaking, problems moving. They suffered from depression. Then they looked at individuals who were not depressed. And when they measured these markers, these things in your blood, both of them had high levels of these inflammatory markers, okay? And guess what? They treat the individual who is depressed and who's not involved in rehab and what have you. They treat them with an antidepressant. The depression begins to abate. Those markers go down. Well, what about the person over here? Treat the patient who has had a stroke and who even is not depressed. Because what it does, remember I told you earlier, it reduces these inflammations. COVID, cytokines, they're all the inflammatory markers. And I told you they use antidepressant, what we know of, Luvox. And guess what it does? It reduces that. And they're going to respond better to rehab. They're going to respond better to making the adjustments in their life as well. Oops, here we go, Jim. Okay, and then there's vascular depression as well. And you're not having a stroke, but hypertension, diabetes, and what have you. And so those pipes, those vessels kind of close up and what have you. You're not getting blood to the brain. When you don't get blood to the brain, you don't get oxygen to the brain. You don't get sugar to the brain, and you can become depressed. So sorting that out. I keep pressing the wrong button here, forgive me. So here's seasonal affective disorder, the winter blues. And it comes when? Yeah, in the fall. Huh? Anticipate that. It's coming in the fall. And they'll say, yeah, Jim, when I'm feeling more blue. I just don't want to do things, come November. I call it November gray. I just, I'm just not interested. But not to the point of being so depressed that it affects, their ability to work, do the basic things, and what have you. And truly, you really don't need to use antidepressants there unless it becomes much more severe, okay? But, the individual withdraws a little more. My brain is a little more like molasses, so I'm doing pretty good tonight, huh? Even though we're in the middle of winter, huh? My brain's functioning pretty well, huh? Gaining, I don't have my glasses here. Gaining weight, yeah, because you're sedentary, craving foods, sugars. People want chocolate when they're depressed. It's an antidepressant, chocolate. I'm not saying you to go out and get some Hershey bars.
People want chocolate, period. End of sentence.
Okay. Okay. But this is a time for using light therapy. And people don't buy into it. A light box? Give me some medication, Jim. They poo-hoo that. And I said, stay with me, try it. Just stay with me and keep trying it. For at least 2 months, you will see a difference. And people do see a difference. But people want the quick fix. They want to go through, the Burger King drive-through. Just take care of it. The quick fix, that's how we are as Americans. We're that way. We have to acknowledge that. So yes, there's seasonal affective disorder that happens during the fall and what have you. And if you have depression, if you really have a baseline of a depressive disorder, and then on top of that, you have a seasonal kind of component to that, you get a double whammy, if you will. Huh? You get a double whammy. So what are the signs and symptoms of that? They're not too different, okay? They really aren't, but they aren't as intense as somebody who is moderately to severely depressed. That does not mean to minimize what they're experiencing, but it's to a lesser degree, the intensity, and it usually will ameliorate and kind of abate as the sun comes up. Do you notice that about what's going on right now for us? I know somebody today said, hey, do you notice the morning there's more daylight? Gee, I noticed that it's daylight now and it's like, it's even gray around 20 past 5. We're thinking about daylight. I look forward to that. As soon as December 21st comes, I know we're on the other side. We're going to start creeping up. Yes?
On the ride in here, we saw some with all the Christmas lights on it, and I thought, I've seen more of that in Vermont than when I lived in Southern Illinois. People are trying to keep cheeriness and trying to keep the brightness going as long as they can. This is the hardest time of the year. That's why we wanted to do the seminar now.
Yeah.
It's probably the most difficult time for seasonal.
It is. It is. And in Southern Illinois, my daughter lives there, and I used to, when I visit her, I'd go by the pastor's old church in Marion. And in Southern Illinois, I talked to my daughter, Tara, I don't know, it was a week and a half ago, and what's the temp there, Tara? Oh, it's 60 degrees. What do you mean? It is a warmer climate. I mean, they get hit with hurricanes and all of that kind of stuff, but, it is a warmer climate, and it's very, very hot.
Tornadoes, not hurricanes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Tornadoes, thank you. What have you, pretty hot. So, I mean, there are symptoms that go along with that as well. The postpartum depression. Okay. What's happening with the bonding between baby and mom? So critical. Yes, food is important. Yes, changing their diaper is important. Yes, providing him shelter is important. But guess what? Studies were done by Bowlby after World War II, and when the Nazis had bombed London and what have you. And there were a lot of children who lost their parents, infants and young ones. And they fed them, they had good shelter, clothes and everything, but they had a syndrome called failure to thrive. And why was that? It was the warmth, it was the holding, it was the nurturing, and what have you. And so you can imagine that there are two things going on here. The mom does have depression, postpartum, but the baby's impacted by that significantly. Okay. So you really got to treat both, huh? You know, you can't just treat the mom. And you can think about, you know, in terms of lactation, if you're depressed, do you think that's going to affect breast milk? I think it will, yeah. It's all, you know, everything's connected. Your hand's connected to your forearm, to your elbow, to your shoulder. Everything is connected, and what have you. Whoops, again here. I'll have this down tomorrow. And so this is kind of a pie, just kind of looking at, if you will, moms who suffer from depression, you know, whether it's severe to mild and moderate and what have you. And I'll say this too, I'll treat a mom who has a postpartum depression and, you know, follow them and they're getting better. And then I said, okay, you know, you've been on this 9, 10 months, you're doing better and what have you. Let's look at taking you off the medication, okay? So it may be situational for that time in terms of that major, major shift in hormones in the body, unless they have a premorbid or if they have a history of depression and what have you. I would encourage them to say, and I don't want you to get caught up in all this fancy stuff here, but you have the endocrine, you have steroids, okay? Changes in the neural path, transmission, inflammation, they got the epigenetics and what have you. Women have all these hormonal changes, huh? And it affects your well-being. And guess what? Men have it too, huh? You see those commercials, Nugenics, huh? You don't have enough energy, you don't have enough virility and what have you. It has to do with testosterone. Our testosterone levels drop off and what have you. So here again is a basis of looking at this from a, if you will, biological perspective, you know. And what we look for postpartum, that's affective disorders, mood disorders, we look for these types of things in terms of their history, difficult temperament in the child, you know, what is the consequence of the mom not nurturing and bonding with the baby. There's a lot of repercussions for that, if you will. And this is where the one that's really concerning. If the person has manic depressive illness, they have a history of that, this is where we'll see postpartum, where they'll go into a psychotic syndrome. And that's one where we need wraparound services. We need to be able to help mom and baby, treat the mom, making sure that, you know, she's bonding with the baby. And sometimes, when I ran a psych unit, sometimes the mom was admitted to the psych unit. It became that concerning because of their loss of reality and a psychosis that they were experiencing. You know, think about this. When you're depressed, you know, you begin to, you're hopeless, you kind of self-loathing yourself, you criticize yourself. And can you imagine ruminative thoughts like that if you're depressed? I'm going to hurt my baby if I pick her up. I have this thought of her not being alive. Can you imagine that as a mom having those intrusive thoughts? Yeah. That's part of depression, postpartum depression. A mom needs to be treated. You know, she needs to be helped, if you will. And it can be embarrassing because, oh my, I don't want to talk about, I've had this thought, Jim, I wanted to harm my baby. I said, that is going on because of what you're experiencing in your depression. Have you planned anything? Have you done anything? And I need to reassure them that that's part of the depression, that intrusive thought, and it's like, if you will, a hamster wheel. They ruminate, they fester. And can you imagine how painful that is for the mom during a time when you have this created being that you and another person have brought forth into the world, and you think you're a terrible mom? It's really hard to see that. It really is. But it's treatable. Okay, it is treatable. And so I'll ask them a whole bunch of questions and what have you to ensure. And then there's this, I'm not going to get into this scale, but there's this Edinburgh scale they'll use in OBGYN to see if there are certain target symptoms and kind of scale them, if you will. Signs and symptoms. We've kind of all gone over this already. Okay. And so it is a cycle, when you think about it, as I've mentioned, you've got your thoughts, cognition, how you think, how you plan. Then you've got your mood, your drive, your initiative. Then you've got all the physical things and how you act and behave, okay? And it does result in this. And guess what? What contributes? What is a major factor for contributing to depression? Inflammation. That's what stress is. Stress is inflammation. I don't use stress. I very rarely use that when I'm talking to a patient. I use the word inflammation with them. I says an inflammation is happening to you, okay? And you can do something about that. And there can be a ton of this, And say if I have a certain personality, I need to be perfect, nobody likes me and what have you. Well, what's the accompanying feelings that might go along with that? And what are some of this shouldn't be there, this is more cognitive, but what are some of the physical symptoms? Well, I really don't want to go to that potluck after church. I don't want to socialize and what have you. And there's all of these types of behavioral responses. So it's really cyclical. It's very cyclical.
Hey, Jim?
Yes.
You mentioned stressors. I think we're all under stress and things that cause anxiety. Stress to me is something that causes your body to rev up. It's the fight or flight. It's a stressor.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, that's an inflammatory response.
That's the hypothalamus. We're going to talk about that when we get into inflammation. The hypothalamus, part of your brain, the pituitary, all the signals come out, and then its effect on your thyroid, your parathyroid, your adrenal glands, your hormones, your sex hormones, and what have you. Yeah, it's an inflammatory response that happens, and that again is what I emphasize is about inflammation, and you can do something about that. So how many people have been to the physician to go see your provider in the past 2 months, 3 months? Okay. Did they have you fill out a health questionnaire? They did. And it might have been the shorter version of this, but this is what a PCP will do, is to at least try to get some assessment. Is depression contributing to why you're coming today? And there's some studies to show about those who commit suicide saw their physician, within a shorter period of time. I can't remember what that was, but they had been evaluated by their primary care provider. And so this is, Medicaid and Medicare require that, and that's in every hospital, that this has to be, this screening has to be done, if you will. And this is what we call a Montgomery Depression scale here that will measure that, and then we'll look at what cumulatively what the score is. And I will talk about this as well as electroconvulsant therapy. And that's what we would do. We would measure these target symptoms, and we do it as well as we're treating somebody with an antidepressant. Or if they have a real resistant depression, we will use electroconvulsant therapy. And you're going to say, Jim, that's Frankensteinian. That's horrendous. Your brain is operating off electricity. But some people have pacemakers. And what's that doing to the heart? It's helping those beats and what have you.
I know a woman who had the CBT. She was so thrilled. She says, I know it sounds like, she said, it was fantastic. It was the best thing she could ever have done, she said.
We've really refined it. And I started up the ECT program here at CVMC with Dr. Tomashow. And I can tell you, I've experienced Lazarus. He looks dead. He looks dead. He's got a severe depression. 2, 3, 4 treatments. Begins to come back to life. Kathy?
Jim and I worked together on that with ECT, and I was the recovery nurse for these patients. And what was very interesting is these patients, I don't know if you've heard the word catatonic. Catatonic means people are so close in that box that there's not a lot of firing going on. They're literally looking through you. They're not looking at you. They're just there. And what happens is there's a series of treatments that happen the first 2 weeks. They go every other day. We're doing 3 a week, right, Jim?
Yeah, usually we do
We were doing
3 treatments.
when we first started.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're doing as many in the week. Anyway,
Yeah.
but the point I'm getting at is within, I felt, a short amount of time, family was noticing before the patient.
Oh yeah, it's always true.
The family always says, you know what, he got up this morning and he actually asked for apple juice for his breakfast. And you're like, apple juice, oh, he's
Yeah.
practicing the mood. No, he asked for apple juice. And these little things that were just amazing. We've seen
Yeah.
a lot of patients do very well. We have
Yeah.
one patient on what we call maintenance. So they only come
Once a month.
Once a month.
Sometimes people once every 2 weeks, depending on what the clinical
And you know what?
presentation is. Yeah.
This individual has said to me that this therapy has saved my life.
And there are side effects, and we're going to talk a little about that probably Thursday, and talk about all these kind of neuromodulation and how we're using some of the research to understand that. But this is as I said, we'll measure this, we'll do this when we're treating. I always, when I'm treating somebody, if I'm going to put them on a medication, I always kind of list at least 3 top target symptoms, because I want to measure that. And like you said, I want to ask, the wife, and they'll see it first. And today, I'm treating this gentleman with the Parkinson's disorder. He says, well, I think this Nuplazid is helping me. He's having the hallucinations. His daughter was there, and she says, he's not talking about it as much, Jim. I says, oh, okay, let's give it some time. Let's stay with it, okay? And hope these auditory voices, the delusions, and the visual hallucinations of seeing these little people will begin to lessen and lessen and lessen. So that's the Montgomery Depression Scale. So, what I try to do too is I have people log their mood, okay? And I think I'm going to have copies of you that have that, and I'll have Pastor Tom put that together. There'll be handouts in that. That I say, hey, can you log your mood for me? Can you do this for 2 weeks? Simple. You don't have to get into, in depth. You don't have to obsess about it, if you will. And here's another part of it as well. Monday through Tuesday, what are some of the emotions you're having? What's your level of motivation, energy? Gee, are you using substances? you know, looking at that and tracking that and seeing, are they responding? There's one thing, I'm very conservative when I come to use medications. And the other thing is, if it's not working, why stay on it? You know, that makes sense to me. There are other things we can go to and try. Okay, here's Jim's real jewel here. I've kind of hounded you guys about inflammation, haven't I? Yeah, I've hounded you, okay? This is a brain that has experienced some inflammation and what have you. So we're talking about life stresses. This is a major life stress. Divorce. What? 25% of marriages remain together. 75-80% of marriages. And then you have children involved and what have you. The level of stress, the fight, flight syndrome that happens, you know, because you are in danger now. You are under threat, okay? If there's infidelity going on, the death of a child. Death of a child. Can you imagine losing a child? We all know that we want to go before our child passes away. And what that does to the relationship, the marriage, and the stress of going through that, it's notable, quite notable. Someone who has substance abuse issues, families dealing with somebody who continues to relapse, you know. A number of times has, you know, needed the ambulance to come, needed Narcan to come alive. And what do we got going on? Got fentanyl going on. They mix it with everything. I don't care if it's coke. I don't care if it's marijuana. I don't care if it's meth. They mix it with everything. And you don't need a lot. You know, suppress your respirations and you're out. We have a major fentanyl, major. Nobody's talking about that. The administration doesn't talk about that. They don't see what's going on in terms of that. You know, natural disaster, you know. As the pastor was talking about these, we know what the tornado that hit, it was like, that big tornado that hit was like 40 miles away from my daughter's house. I can't remember the town, I don't know if you remember it. The whole town was wiped out for like 20 miles, this swath. Any people remember that? Yeah, in Kentucky, but it also happened in parts of Illinois. But, you know, I think it was right near Paducah. My daughter's like 40 miles from where it happened. But can you imagine losing your home? You know, victim of a gun shooting, crime. Wow, crime is just through the roof right now. And then you have life events that are going to happen anyhow here, huh? That you're going to, job-related stress and what have you. Oh, wow, they gave me a raise, but inflation has just ate that away. Okay, they gave me a raise for, I'm giving you an example. They gave me a raise of 5%. Oh, wow. But I'm -2 because inflation was 7%. What do finances do to people? Oh, can't pay the bills. I was talking to a lady today. She's having all this inflammation because of her finances and what have you. Certainly past histories of being victimized. Where was I here? Life trauma events and what have you. Let's see this here. Sexual, physical, psychological abuse. What that does to the growing brain. It's real. It's very, very real. The kind of chronic stresses that can happen as well. So this is inflammation, and it's all around us, it's all about us, and it has a great impact on...
I saw school-related stress.
Yes.
Do you realize school and education has become paramount in anybody who has children now? Because of going, you know, long-distance learning versus mask in school versus, you know, all kinds of things. It's really created a lot of stress.
Yeah. I don't care what you say, that I would never want to learn through a computer. Where's the interpersonal contact? Where's the empathy that happens between the teacher and the students, or the students with the students? Remember what I said. If she has a thought, and Greg has a thought, and she has a thought, and you have a thought, and we're in the classroom talking about it, it stimulates our brain. It stimulates our brain, so we're associating and opening up new tributaries in the brain. And so this whole idea of online stuff, and I won't get into all the teachers stuff and what's going on there, and I'm not here to debate that at all, but these are our children, let alone what these masks are doing to our children. We'll see studies coming out 5 years, 10 years down the road. No, oops, I need to go back to that. So here, again, I'm talking about chronic inflammation, cancer, metabolic disorders, diabetes, neurological, chronic inflammatory diseases, all this fibromyalgia and all of that. Those are all autoimmune processes that happen because your body is turning in on itself. And so here's this fight-flight response, Initially, in terms of how we dealt with this, it really had to do with infections and what have you. But now, if there is a threat, my body perceives that threat even if I can't consciously be aware of it. Did you get that? We're created so we can discern a threat without even bringing it into a thought. That's very, very interesting. And then there's a whole panoply, a cascade of things that happen when we go through stress, okay? And look at this here. This is, I just threw this up. I know it's another fancy thing. But the reason I wanted to point this out, again, there is a basis to exercise. There's a basis to your diet. There's a basis to all of this. There's something you can do to take care of yourself, brain maintenance and your whole body maintenance. But here is looking at connectivity in terms of this is a control group, this is a group who has inflammation and what have you in this part of the brain. And look at the connectivity in terms of them versus the control, in terms of the connectivity that's going on that they can measure, okay, in terms of these functional MRIs and all the fancy things they can do. And so the connectivity is not there. People are suffering significant stress. So we have to talk about mice and rats, don't we?
Sure.
Okay.
We're in a church, we have church mice, probably.
Okay. I put this up here because this is a mouse who learned helplessness. And I'm not going to tell you what they did, and what have you. This is an individual, they left them alone. That S stands for shock. So there was something going on. There was no shock here. The learned helplessness, they were doing something to this. And remember that axon I showed you and those little buds coming off of it? Do you remember that earlier thing? Well, this is measuring an individual, a mouse. Jim, they're not individuals.
Individual mouse.
Okay, thank you. And so here you have this, all these dendrites, and you can see they're lacking in terms of the dendrites. Now they treated them with, don't worry about this, interleukin 10, which is an anti-inflammatory thing that your body produces. Isn't that beautiful? You're created so your body has these anti-inflammatory chemicals that happen, not chemicals, but hormones and what have you. And look at this same mouse, look at its dendrites now. Is it thicker? Huh? This is learned helplessness and inflammation, stress they put the little mouse through. And then after that, they treated them with this substance. Not that we would use that substance on a human, but I wanted to share with you this biological consequences to inflammation. Do not underestimate that. Do not underestimate. I'm sorry?
What is the NLH, one of the pills?
Non-learned helplessness, NLH. Yeah. So remember, Pastor Tom was talking about that in terms of the fight, flight, and there's also the freeze. And here is this, the hypothalamus is up here in your brain. Then you've got the pituitary gland, okay? The hypothalamus signals to the pituitary. The pituitary then pushes out all these hormones to your thyroid, to your adrenal glands that are on top of your kidneys here and what have you. And what does the adrenal glands push out? What kind of glucocorticoids, corticosteroids, okay? And that gets you ready, and your body puts out norepinephrine and epinephrine. Because guess what? When you're under threat, your pupils will get small. Your muscles will tense. You will try to reserve as much energy that you have because you have to deal with the threat that's before you. There is a consequence to this inflammation. And hopefully I have the picture to that, okay? Here's just talking about this in terms of its effect, you know, and these in terms of chemicals, you know, the things we take showers with, the things we're exposed to. You know, I remember when I started painting houses when I was 10 years old. And guess what that paint had in it? Pica. You know what pica is. They test the kids for lead levels. And what does lead do to the brain and the ability to think and process information? That's what that is, you know. Disturbed sleep. You don't sleep well, you're messing with your whole hormonal neurotransmitters and what have you. Your gut, if you will, your diet, okay? Obesity. There's several studies, I think I'm gonna point that out, where somebody's depressed and they're suffering from obesity, that it interferes with the antidepressant to be able to really have a therapeutic effect. And so then you could see, we touched upon this, you know, this is non-fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the consequences to that, all these processes that are happening as a result of that. And so you get depressed, you know, whoops, here we go, Jim. Hey. So you get depressed, you know, and, you know, this gets activated, your adrenal glands push all this out, and then this sends a message out, chronic inflammation, okay? And let's see if I can get the picture. I don't know if I have that picture, but I'll use this here. Right in this area of the brain. What they've done here is they've taken the brain and say they got hinges on it. They cut it in half, and we're looking inside the brain, okay? That's what we're doing. And there's an area here called the hippopotamus, the hippocampus, fancy word, okay? It looks like a seahorse. That's why they use hippocampus. They use hippo. And that's where your memory is. That's where your novel memory is in terms of learning new things, okay? You learn new things. And guess what? These hormones, in terms of cortisol and all these corticosteroids, they have a negative effect on the front part of this area that has to do with your memory. And what it does do, it atrophies. It atrophies an important area of the brain that has to do with learning. And you have it on both sides. That's what stress does. A fellow down at Dartmouth was doing all this work on the front part, we're calling the anterior part of the hippocampus. And, you know, this was what's going on. And so you get all these inflammation. And what's this right here? Cytokines. Remember what I said earlier? What we're dealing with for the past 2 years with this COVID? You've heard them speak about this, I'm sure. It's this, you know, overwhelming surge of cytokines in your body. Huh? Inflammatory, the lungs fill up, inflammation, your heart, and what have you. And there have been so many deaths from the COVID virus because of these cytokines, this surge of inflammatory markers that happen. So that's why I put that up there to make sense of that. And I think I did that here as well, the cytokines. And then you have this inflammatory response. This is your blood vessel, okay, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and what have you. And you can get a real thickening, if you will, within those blood vessels with an inflammatory response. And it's about stress. It's about inflammation. Okay, what did I put here? What did I put here? Okay, yeah. Oh, this is talking about inflammation and its effect on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, Zoloft, oh my gosh, Celexa, Lexapro, Mirtazapine, that inflammation interferes with the ability of some of these antidepressants to do their job, if you will. And this is very, very interesting. So they did a study looking at these indigenous people, these tribes, and they measured the CRP level, which is it's an inflammatory marker, okay? If you've had some blood work done, he's measuring that, okay? And they looked at the levels of this inflammatory marker in these indigenous people when they got infections. And this is how it kind of averaged out. Look at US males and look at males and females in the United States. Look at the level of this CRP. Just look at this bar. We're surrounded by inflammation. And when somebody has a stroke, if you measure that marker in their blood, you'll see it's up, you know. You'll see if somebody's under a lot of stress, you know, this is the body's response, pushing this stuff out to protect you, if you will. These are markers. And here it is again, looking at an individual who smoked, an individual who was using alcohol, and body mass index. They looked at this in terms of inflammatory markers and stress, their stress response. Look at a smoker versus a non-smoker. You can go to a smoking cessation class to help with smoking. Huh? It's there for you. Look at this in terms of looking at individuals with alcohol use in terms of their stress level and how they manage stress. Well, inflammation. Look at the individuals whose body mass index, you know, they're overweight versus lean versus obese, and how their body handles stress, measuring that. And this is, what you need to know here is, this is an individual, okay, not an individual, this is a measurement of looking at an individual's response to Lexapro, okay, and how does it lower target symptoms and what have you in the levels of this antidepressant in your body. And you know, there's a noticeable difference with individuals who have a lot of sugar, if you will. Think about diabetes and you wonder, how is diabetes affecting a person I'm treating for depression and they're obese and have hypertension? How does that affect the medication to work, if you will? It is going to affect that, if you will. But this is very, very interesting. Remember I told you about markers of inflammation? Okay? Now look at this here. They look at cries easily, tired, weak, difficulty concentrating, okay? Then they looked at these markers, okay? And so for an individual who's quite emotional and what have you, this marker right here, okay, which is this interleukin 1B, and this marker right here, which is interleukin 6, they're up. So we can measure these inflammation markers that are in your body. We can measure that and see if you're complaining of being tired or concentration and what have you. And the same here as well. Individuals, if you will, let's look at this, having irregular sleep. let's look at the inflammatory markers that this is called tumor necrosis factor. Here we have another inflammatory response. Look at this inflammatory response with this interleukin 6. And then there's the CRP. And look at the CRP for an individual who's pessimistic and cynical. As a person thinks, so they are. Proverbs says in 23:7. And I kind of changed that. You'll have to forgive me. So if there were, people had an issue with gender, it does say, as he thinks, so is he. And so I put, more kind of neutral thing if people had a problem. But look at this. Do you think focusing and concentrating on things that are negative, things that are unhealthy and what have you in your thought process, do you think that increases your inflammation? It does. Again, you can do something about that. We're almost done here, people. I think I've gone over my time. And here again, in terms of looking at this here, these markers, exercise, and it doesn't have to, you don't have to go, run a mile and what have you. They say now, walking at least 3-4 times a week for 15 minutes will have this effect. Lower your cortisol levels, okay? Lower this inflammatory marker and this one and this one and this one. And look at what it does do. Anybody that was a runner, did cross country or that, huh? What did they call the second wind, John?
A runner's high.
Yeah, the cannabinoids, the endorphins, the enkephalins, all of that kind of, and for that first phase when you're not into that second wind, you got the pain here, you're huffing and puffing. You get into that second wind, you could go for 20 more miles. No, I couldn't, but you could go, because you're in that second wind. And this is what exercise does. Exercise can target these inflammatory markers. Exercise can affect your mood. Exercise can help you with a whole host of things, okay? And we'll be talking about that, not necessarily tonight. I'm going to stop there, okay, because it's I'm going on and on and on and on, and you've let me do that because you've been a great audience. So anything that I've covered so far about looking at depression and some of the biological underpinnings of that, and I really stressed inflammation and what have you. And again, I did that because when we get into what are some of the strategies, you'll say, oh yeah, that makes sense, Jim. This is why I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And there's a scientific basis to it. And you're in the driver's seat. You can do something about it in terms of your choices and decisions that you make. You can do something about your health and what have you. Any kind of questions that you've been wondering about that I might try to answer? Was it understandable? It wasn't.
You didn't go too far into it.
Okay, yeah, I tried not to, John. I kind of tried to watch the clinical language I was using, although I did throw some in there. No, because it makes myself look good, if I can use those fancy terms, No, I'm only kidding you. And so forgive me if I did use some of them, but yeah, that's good. I'm glad I saw you all shaking your heads. Yes, Cindy? It does. I mean, how much are you of water? How much you consist of water? Right now,
Same as the planet.
Before you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. I don't know if you see me licking my lower lip and that. I'm thirsty. There was somewhere in the middle there, I was going to ask somebody to get me some water or what have you. But you're right. Hydration is so important. And not hydration with Coke. Yeah, water. And you got to develop a taste for water.
Yeah. Well, the Vermont water we're drinking here is better than any
There you go.
Any other place we live.
You know what I put in my water? It's in my car right now. I have my thermostat. I put a little lime or lemon juice.
Yeah.
It's a little more palatable, you know? Yeah. We'll talk about that in terms of good brain maintenance when we get into that and all those kind of strategies. But yeah, water is so essential. Your cells need water.
Yeah, for energy.
Yes, great.
I find winter exercise in the form of snowmobiling or skiing, or you just gotta get out and do something.
Yeah.
You go stir crazy.
You're living in this environment. You have to go with the flow. You have to go with the flow. Cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, you know, just sitting underneath a pine tree and taking some of the pine needles and breaking them. One very prolific writer, her name is Ellen White, she talked about on the west side of your house, okay, hopefully a distance away, so if they topple, they won't topple your house. You should put pine trees. When you smell pine and you smell that, isn't that like, isn't that invigorating?
Yeah.
Huh? It's so invigorating.
That reminds me of aromatherapies.
Oh, we're going to be talking about that. We're going to, you're stealing my show. Stop it. We're going to talk about that in terms of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and how they're using this little aroma thing and how it will give a spray when the monitor that you have senses muscle tension, pulse going up, blood pressure going up, and I love frankincense. Frankincense is one of my favorite. I have it in my office, and I talk with people about it. But we'll talk about that as well. All the strategies that are practical that we can use, you know, because when you needed your mother's milk, you didn't say, Mom, I need some milk. You didn't say, hey, Mom, I need the breast. You smelt it. Or they did the rooting reflex like this, and the baby would turn their head. But you smelt how essential that primitive thing is. And I'll just leave you with this. I can go off on these tangents. Have you noted that? It's how I kind of present. That several studies of looking at individuals who have dementia, and for what it's worth, they can't smell things. And I would go into a nursing home, I'd have spearmint, I'd have coffee beans, and I'd have some ammonia. And I would ask the resident, can you smell that? Can you smell that? Can you smell that? Your olfactory bulb, and we'll be talking about this, is loaded with a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, okay? And guess what? Remember I told you about those hippos, those hippopotamus that live in your brain here on both sides? And I said, why was those so important? Because of learning, novelty of learning. Guess what neurotransmitter is highly concentrated in there? Acetylcholine. So you get the connection? If I have lower levels of acetylcholine that are so essential in that part of my brain for learning, I can also test that by sense of smell. Because what's in that olfactory bulb? A major neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Do you get the connection here? Am I making sense? Okay?
You have to repeat that.
If you're smelling well, you're learning well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yes, yes. So we should close there, and I've gone way over. I don't even know what time it is, people.
He said it was going to be 40 to 50 minutes, and I think it's been 2 hours.
Oh, my Lord.
And it's been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We've learned a lot, haven't we? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Appreciate
So
it.
this is a real treat for us to have a professional who's trying to retire.
Yes.
They might actually allow it by the end of this month.
April 5th.
No, it's not supposed to be the end of this month.
No, April 5th. I'm hanging the gloves up.
So the
But-
February was just a...
But what I will do is do presentations, try to take my experience, what God has given me in terms of knowledge, and being able to share that, you know, with lectures and helping people out. But I won't be doing clinical practice. I won't have that responsibility, that inflammation. And it's a big inflammation. It really is.
And don't we have huge need for what we do? And we don't have enough people to do it?
We don't. Psychiatric nurse practitioners at my level, 2 years ago, they polled and they looked at ages of psychiatric nurse practitioners. This was 2 years ago. 70% of us psychiatric nurse practitioners here in Vermont were over the age of 65. What does that tell you? Pretty significant.
Yeah.
Pretty significant, yeah.
So yeah, what I want to say, what I like to do is I like to incentivize people to bring someone else here. Now, some of us, in the different age ranges, different types of depression, different causes for depression, you might know someone that is struggling and benefit from what we're hearing. And what I want to do is if you bring someone to tomorrow night's presentation that you can think of, whether it's a family member, a friend of yours, coworker, we have 3 options for you. The Healing Power of Forgiveness is a book that we would give you free. There's another one, Life Without a Critical Spirit. We have several of these available. We have 2 of the first books available, and I only have 1 of these, the Little Book of Self-Esteem, You Are Worth It. So these are good, positive thoughts that, so any one of these 3 options, if you bring someone, it's free to you. It's a gift to say thank you for reaching out to someone else in need. Okay? So that,
We'll see you tomorrow, and I'll really kind of condense it, and I won't.
You got started late too.
That's true, too.
With only 2 neurons, you need to get out and exercise.
with 2 neurons, you did well.
You need to get out and exercise.